tonight we're delighted to welcome the Right Honourable Sir David Lidington. Thank you very much for agreeing to talk to us. I should mention, as usual, before we start, that we're a cross-party and non-party pro-Europe group, open to listening to views from across the political spectrum. My name's Fiona Wishlade. Also with us on the chat are Dee Banfield and Bernd Poor. Dee's monitoring social media for any questions that come through on Facebook or Twitter. So please send them in if you have them, and we'll try and pick them up in the conversation. And Bernd's making sure that all the technology works for us and is recording the session so that people can watch it later on Facebook and YouTube. Okay, well, I think David Lidington doesn't really need any introduction, but I should say a few words anyway. You were MP for Aylesbury for 27 years, and you've held a number of key posts in government. These include being what people always refer to as being the de facto deputy Prime Minister in Theresa May's government, as if you weren't quite the real thing, but you might want to comment on that. You stepped down from government in July 2019 before Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, and you decided not to stand at the last election, but you're clearly still very active in politics, and amongst other things, a chair of the Conservative European Forum, which we'll maybe come on to a bit about later on. So there are lots of things that we could ask you about, although our main interest is in our relations with Europe and the wider sort of domestic political scene. Now, I know that you've done quite a number of lengthy interviews and podcasts with people like the Institute for Government and Rusi and Nick Robinson and others. So we wanted to maybe pick up on a few things that have had a bit less attention in those discussions. So maybe I can start with a couple of questions from about the time from before the Brexit referendum. And you were Minister for Europe in the Foreign Office for 6 years, which I think is the longest serving Europe Minister ever. And one of the things that you initiated was the Balance of Competences review, which is a sort of audit of what the EU does and how it affects the UK, and whether the balance of things is right. And I mean, broadly speaking, these 30 or so reports concluded that the balance was right, and yet somehow that didn't seem to cut through or maybe inform the referendum or the preparation for the referendum as much as it might have done. Could you maybe tell us a bit more about that process and what came from it, and perhaps what its shortcomings were in terms of?
Sure. I mean, it was an interesting exercise. It came out of something within the coalition programme for government that the Conservative and Liberal Democrat parties had negotiated in 2010 when that government was formed. And it was an attempt to bridge the difference between the two parties' positions, one of a number of bridges between the two parties' positions on Europe. And it was a pledge to examine, I think the phrase was, the current balance of competences between the UK and the European Union. And so, having taken through Parliament the Act which provided for a referendum lock on future treaty change, which also came out of the coalition programme, I turned to the balance of competences. Now, I'll be completely honest with you, I saw this as a way, because remember David Cameron in January 2013 had made his pledge of a referendum, not on behalf of the whole government, but on behalf of the Conservative Party. They said this would be in the manifesto at the next election. And I believed that David, and certainly the majority of the Conservative leadership, wanted to see the United Kingdom remain in the EU and saw the referendum as the means to cement that, to put an end to the arguments that had beset the party and the Parliament over membership. And that certainly was what had been in the minds of David and William Hague in particular. And I thought that the Balance of Competences review would almost certainly turn out to provide first a safe space in which industry and other organizations, civil society organizations, could express their views about our membership of the EU by reference to practical experience, without feeling that they were being drawn into a partisan battle. So it was to provide a safe space, and I thought that that would then provide a reservoir of evidence about the merits of EU membership. Now, my own view was, and always had been, that the membership of the European Union was a matter of national interest, and that while there were things about the European Union that, as the minister, and I used to get very frustrated about at times, as the Union, you didn't win every battle, but well, I think most of the important ones. But that on, when you looked at the overall balance, it was in favour of continued membership, and I haven't repented of that view at all since the referendum. I still feel the referendum outcome was a blow to this country. But I thought it would be the reservoir of that. And I think what went wrong was, I mean, to some extent, I suppose it was technical, but there was a conscious decision that, David Cameron took as Prime Minister, that the reports, because they appeared to be so, come down so much in favour of the current balance, were going to be red rag to a bull when it came to handling both the Eurosceptic wing of the Conservative Party and the rising challenge of UKIP in the country. And therefore, the government did not make use of them in the way that I had envisaged it would, in order to help it make the case. And so I think by the time we got to the actual referendum, in a sense, the debate had moved on from that. And I think it was a great pity, because I think there was a lot of good evidence in there. The most difficult thing that I found in conducting the Balance of Competences review was to get the hard evidence of where things were not working particularly well. I mean, most industry groups would come up with particular proposals to tweak this or that directive, or in the case of services business, to go much further in terms of developing the single market in services. But with the exception of fishing, where in fairness, I think the fishing organisations did produce evidence that was very critical of the CFP, it was difficult. So you actually, to take probably one of the key contentious issues of the referendum campaign, which was freedom of movement, getting local authorities who had experience of high inward migration through EU freedom of movement to actually say, look, this is causing strains on our services in particular ways, proved nigh on impossible. And the Home Office was very reluctant to provide us with evidence to, if you like, put on the other side of the ledger. So that was the most difficult thing about it. I still think whether it would have swung the referendum, had more use been made of that evidence, we will never know. But I think there was an opportunity missed.
Yeah, that was really interesting to have some insights as to what was quite a long and detailed process. And just also, sort of like before the Brexit referendum, there'd been a referendum on Scottish independence, not all that long before. And one of the arguments on the no side had been that an independent Scotland would have to leave the EU and then apply to rejoin. Now, I mean, we don't really know to what extent that argument cut through with people, but But given that that argument was made, was any thought given to the design of the Brexit referendum, like a requirement that there should be a majority in all four nations?
Not enough. I think that I think it would have been. It was difficult. There was no easy answer to this. I mean, when I look back, that is one of those questions where I wish that, even though I was a Minister of State, I wasn't in the cabinet at that time. But I wish I perhaps made more of a fuss about at the time. I don't know whether it would have made any significant difference. The key discussions were taking place between the Prime Minister and a small group of senior cabinet ministers, and certainly any attempt to have required, for example, all four nations to vote in favour, or to impose, say, a 60 or 66% threshold, would have enraged people on the other side of the argument, and I think would have made it therefore more difficult to have actually used the referendum to settle the issue. Because I think one thing is certain, that had there been a 52-48 to leave the European Union, but it had fallen short of the threshold, we would then have gone straight into a prolonged period of very, very bitter political dissension indeed. I think the other thing, I've always felt that the fact that different parts of the United Kingdom voted, different nations of the United Kingdom voted in opposite ways, made it likely, could see this in the offing, it made it likely that the outcome of the referendum would require very sensitive handling. And certainly when the results were known, it was clear to me that this is going to be very tricky in terms of constitutional issues, with two nations voting to leave, two to remain. I think that one of the problems about having a Scottish lock or an Irish lock or Welsh lock or whatever is that if we run the counterfactual, that the vote had gone narrowly the other way to remain, and the Scottish or Northern Irish votes to remain had outweighed an English majority to leave, we'd have had an outburst of sort of nationalist feeling in England, I think, as a consequence of that. Now, my view was very clear. Look, I'd be saying this in Parliament to sort of SNP colleagues, that if the vote is narrow and it's to remain and it's carried on Scottish votes, that means England is going to remain as well, even if England is votes to leave. So there was no easy outcome. I do wonder sometimes whether I should have pushed harder for a threshold, but I suspect that there would not have been a different policy, actually, even if I had personally made more of a fuss about it.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's easy to say things with hindsight, but obviously, the vote in Scotland was 62% to remain, and so which is more than decisive, and is behind. I think, given the arguments that were made by the no camp, there is a certain sense of betrayal, if it's not putting it too strongly.
I think the other thing to remember in terms of the political decision taking at the time was that right up until the summer of 2015, the opinion polls across the UK were showing a clear majority to remain, and an even bigger majority to remain, sort of over 60, over 60-40, more like 65-35. If when people were presented with the hypothesis that David Cameron came back from a successful negotiation in Brussels with improved terms. And that clearly changed greatly in the months between, I think, August 2015 and the referendum in 2016. And there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that it turned out the timing was almost the worst possible moment. August 2015, if you remember, was dominated by Calais. It will headline every news bulletin and presented not as an industrial dispute in France, which is what it really was, but as a migration crisis for the UK. And then when that died off, and you could see the poles narrow on Europe at that point through August. And then September, that Calais issue died away. But then we had the refugee crisis from Syria, Turkey, Aegean, Balkans, Germany, Austria. And you could see the impact, and you could measure as an MP the impact on the doorstep and in your constituency postbag over that.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So moving on to your time in the May government and thinking about the Brexit negotiations was so complicated and protracted both domestically and with the EU. I mean, in hindsight, was there a better way of doing things? Article 50 was triggered after just 9 months, and by then the red lines had been drawn on the single market and the customs union. Do you think there might have been scope for a more deliberative approach? Maybe through some kind of grand committee in Parliament, or even a citizens' assembly, to look at what the options were, and if so, do you think it would have changed anything?
I think that I don't know whether a grand committee would have been the right tool. I think looking back that the Conservative government should have tried reaching out to opposition parties earlier than it did. Now, I think one has to recognise that this was difficult, particularly after Jeremy Corbyn became leader of the Labour Party, that you had a Labour leader who had been a staunch opponent of Tony Blair from the Labour backbenches, so most of the Blair government and the Brown government, and who is certainly seen, and I would argue, as a Tory with good reason, was seen as somebody who was, in the British political spectrum, pretty far over on the left. And I think doing a deal with Jeremy Corbyn was a much tougher swallow for Conservatives than doing a deal with a hypothetical alternative Labour leader, with a Hilary Benn or an Yvette Cooper or an Andy Burnham or even Ed Balls. So that, I think, was significant. I think what was significant too, when you look at the Tory leadership in 2016, was that Theresa May won the leadership in large part because Boris Johnson and Michael Gove destroyed each other's campaigns. And so I think she, when she came in, felt that she had to demonstrate, having voted to remain, that she was going to deliver what the Leavers wanted, or life was going to be completely intolerable. And not just that committee, but I think we should have reached out earlier. I think that would have been a sensible thing too. I also wonder about whether, again, this is with hindsight, it didn't seem at all simple like this at the time, that what we should have done is made a very swift move into the European Economic Area. And said, right, we'll go as a holding position, we'll go into a Norway position, so we can say, look, legally we've left. And then that provides the thinking time over a couple of years to decide actually where we want to go. My personal view is that Norway was not a sustainable long-term option. I felt particularly on services, and special financial services, that an EU without the UK at the table helping to make the rules was almost certain to move in a more protectionist direction, that at some stage would run up against a UK interest, which no British Prime Minister of any party could easily simply swallow in the way that Norway and Iceland have to swallow.
Yeah.
And I think my ideal was you try to get, it would look a bit like checkers. You get a convergence with the EU on goods, where the acquis was pretty stable, but you'd have more freedom of action on services where things were much, much less certain. But Norway, I think Norway might have provided a holding position to allow that thought, to allow the immediate tensions and rivalries, the aftermath of the referendum to settle for a bit. We'll never know whether that would have worked, but looking back, that I think is a route that we might have taken, and which I think Merkel in particular was very willing to consider.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And would that have involved the UK staying in the customs union as well, or leaving the customs union?
I think that's an open question. You could have tried to do it either way. I mean, I think Norway clearly is not part of the customs union with the EU. I think that actually having to answer that question might have brought the Northern Ireland issue to the forefront of people's minds earlier than was actually the case. So I think my view is, probably, I would have had no ideological objection to staying in the customs union, at least pro tem, while we worked out exactly where we wanted to go in the longer term.
Yeah. Okay, that's really interesting. Okay, I mean, the next question is one of about sort of like tone, and I suppose the kind of cultural divide that seemed to underpin the referendum in many ways. And I wonder, what did you make of the Citizens of Nowhere segment of Theresa May's conference speech in 2016? Weren't phrases I would have used. I mean, the way I would personally put it was much more in the way Edmund Burke put it, where he described a hierarchy of relationships. I think the single phrase that sticks in my mind is no cold relation can be a zealous citizen. And the classic sort of Burkean Tory approach would be to say you start with the intimate low-level relationships with families, households, local communities, the informal civil society organization, anything from a sports club to a church or mosque or synagogue, to a political party, a trade union, and so on. And then if you like, at a slightly higher level of those sit the sort of national sort of formal political institutions. So I think that I would argue that I don't know exactly why and how that phrase was drafted, and it was as Philip Hammond has said, the speech was not circulated far outside Number 10 until it was delivered. But I think I would have put it in that way, so that you have to be a citizen of somewhere. You have to be rooted in order to have a European or a global identity. And I don't see the conflict between the two. I think one of the realities of the United Kingdom, of Europe, and increasingly of the world, is that people inhabit multiple identities. As a unionist, I can feel English and British, and make the case in Scotland and Northern Ireland and Wales that it is possible to feel intense national loyalty, but also feel part of the UK, and to feel European as well. I probably actually, ironically, feel more European as a result of the Brexit referendum and those debates than I did beforehand, because it did crystallise, I think, a consciousness amongst a lot of British people that this was a part of how they thought about themselves and their place in the world that they had not defined before. I mean, never before the referendum has there been an organised, vocal, articulate body of pro-European opinion in the United Kingdom. It's been very much a hobby for a minority, not the case any longer. So I think that has shifted attitudes. But multiple identity, I think, is one of the key things that it affects. Obviously, the debate about Europe. It affects the debate about the future of the UK. It affects very directly the massive social policy challenge over the balance between
integration and respect for cultures of people who have immigrated to the United Kingdom. Again, as a constituency MP, I used to love it when I was invited to the Indian or Pakistani or Caribbean celebrations, and I thought it's perfectly possible for somebody to celebrate their, let's say, Indian heritage, but also feel British as well. So, national identity, I think, is something that is key to cracking a lot of problems.
I mean, it's interesting now that the European movement in the UK is now the biggest such national European Movement Association, and I mean, I guess it's fairly rare for a quote from a Tory leader's speech to find its way into so many Twitter handles as this one has. Okay, Dee, you have something that's come up on social media that you want to feed in?
There's a couple of questions around the same issue, which is the freedom of movement. So one is, how much of Theresa May's position comes from being firmly decided to end freedom of movement? And would you think it plausible we could ever see the benefits rather than having it only ever presented as a problem? Because that did seem to be one of the issues. And the other one is the same thing about freedom of movement, but concentrating particularly on young people. And so do you think it would be sustainable to have limited the movement of our young people? In many cases, many of them still assume they can work across Europe. And I think the pandemic has meant that nobody's really moving. So nobody has really had that experience. And we had a chat a few months ago with a guy who ran a company to do with kids going out to work in ski resorts, for example. And obviously that's going on, but it's going to be that much more complicated for them in the future. So any thoughts on that?
I think that to answer the first question, and although by the end of her term I was working very closely with Theresa, I feel slightly awkward about sort of trying to explain her position. I think it is fair to say it's a combination of two things. She did regard ending freedom of movement as essential. And that did have a big impact upon her more general approach to exit policy. Her reasons, I think, were twofold. First was her experience as Home Secretary and trying to deliver on the net migration target that had been in the manifesto and those policies that she was giving, and being frustrated that, in particular, not just by the general principle of free movement, but there was particular case law from the CJEU. Which made it, for example, imposed an easier test on EU nationals, other than British, wanting to bring a third country spouse into the UK than British citizens in exactly the same position faced. And so she had those things in her mind. The other thing was, I think there's no getting away from the fact that during the referendum campaign, free movement was the most important single policy issue. There was a general sense of wanting to get back control. That Cummings slogan was extremely skillfully crafted. But what the Leave campaign did very successfully was to link the sort of abstract notion of control with the concrete example of migration, and drawing on people's very recent memories of Calais and of the refugee flows from Syria and elsewhere in the Middle East. I can remember, campaigning for Remain in my constituency, knocking on so many doors and people coming out, and they would say two things. It would be, I'm worried about all these Eastern Europeans coming over, and in their minds, this was a subset of a more general concern about immigration policy. And then they would also say something like, I voted in 1975 to join a common market. I don't want a political union. And these were not, sort of people who you'd write off or certainly should not be dismissed as extremists and headbangers. Like these, serious, decent people who were unhappy when the question was put to them, were unhappy about important aspects of the relationship with the UK. And Theresa had that experience too, very much in her mind. And every opinion poll throughout most of the lifetime of the May government was showing that the majority of the public, including Labour voters, including Remain voters, however you segmented it, wanted to see firmer control of immigration. And she saw resistance to freedom of this party. Now, take the second question. That the balance of advantage and disadvantage? Yes, I think more could have been made of that. I think that again, it's one of those cases where you say, look, there are downsides, but actually there's a big upside as well. And it's something that we did get into the balance of competences report, in which I can remember an argument I can remember making in the referendum campaign, and afterwards about the number of British people that benefited, the number of British people who were living elsewhere in Europe, and the number of people in my constituency who had spouses from another EU country. It was a very, very interesting, and I think that it's very interesting that who knows if it's exact cause and effect, but since the referendum, we've seen public concern about immigration drift downwards again, and it's back at relatively low levels now. And I think that in terms of as we go forward, as we think about how is it possible to build on the TCA, I think sensible discussion about migration partnerships, and focusing certainly initially on particular skills, perhaps on particular ages, particular reasons for wanting to move, is one way in which I think you could start a serious conversation that would not necessarily be just the non-conservative parties either. It's interesting that there are even at senior levels of the present government, who have historically had quite a liberal approach to immigration policy more generally, but have wanted it related more closely to particular skills. I think that the two things that have grated with, if you like, your average Leave voter were, first of all, benefit claims, and secondly, the stories you often saw in the Mail, Telegraph, Express, and so on, Sun, about people who had committed crimes, but who could not be deported, allegedly, because of some European judicial decision. And certainly there was an issue with the EU that under the, as you know, under the treaty rules, you couldn't deport somebody who'd committed a crime unless it was above a certain threshold of seriousness. I know a good, strong Remainer friend of mine who's sitting as a magistrate in London saying it is very frustrating. So I said, I've got probably half of the cases before me are people from Central Europe, and there's very little we can do about them. We can't deport them at the rate that they should be, and they are just locked in a life of petty crime at the moment.
Okay, that's really really interesting. It's good to touch on the freedom of movement and immigration issue. A couple of questions now about the implications for the union and where we are now, and both John Major and Tony Blair are on record warning about the implications of Brexit for Northern Ireland and for the union more generally, and these warnings didn't really seem to be widely heeded. Now, obviously, you know Northern Ireland well from your time as Shadow Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. Why did it take so long for Northern Ireland to emerge as a critical issue in Brexit?
It's deeply frustrating. I went to campaign for Remain in Northern Ireland. and broadcast. I mean, of course, the then Northern Ireland Secretary, Theresa Villiers, was an ardent leaver, and that had an impact, no doubt. I think the brutal truth is that there are far too many people, particularly in England, but I think it's true of Wales and Scotland as well, who are pretty indifferent to Northern Ireland, who don't really understand the politics and are exasperated by the politics of Northern Ireland. I think the broader issue, I actually think English indifference is as big a threat to the Union as nationalism in either Scotland or Northern Ireland is. But I just think that people did not want to focus on it, and the view of those who led the Leave campaign was that it was all a made up issue, that I don't think people had gone into the detail. I don't think most Westminster politicians do not have a profound understanding of Northern Ireland, nor are really wanting to acquire it, because it has no resonance with their own constituents. So I think that was the fundamental thing. And you also had, of course, the biggest unionist party, plus a section of the UUP, campaigning to leave. And that certainly made a difference to Conservative audiences. Oh, well, the people we think of as our friends are on that side. So I just think that I think it's that combination of factors. Insufficient attention, to be blunt with you.
Okay, so then turning to other parts of the union. Back in June 2019, there was a YouGov poll of Conservative Party members, and it suggested that 63% of party members would rather Brexit happened, even if it meant Scotland left the Union, and 59% said the same thing about Northern Ireland. Today, I haven't seen the report, but it's reported in the papers, I think. There's been a report by Philip Rycroft, who, as you'll know, was Perm-Sec in DexEU, and he's saying that the union is in deep peril. And do you think he's right? And do you think that the government is now just sort of reaping what's been sown over the last few years?
I remember being shocked by that poll. There's always a question as to what the context is, what the other questions leading up to the one that gets the headline were, because we know that can have quite a big effect on responses, and also even an organisation as good as YouGov, are they really able to trace a sufficiently large sample of people who are party members when the number of members of any political party are relatively small as a proportion of the population as a whole? So anyway, leave that to one side. I'm even if the results have been there've been 10% difference in those outcomes, I still found it pretty shocking. And I agree completely with Philip. With whom I've discussed these issues many times, and but I think that that Brexit has worsened and intensified the risks to the Union. But I think that this has been quite a long time brewing. I think that you can track the rise of Scottish nationalism going back over many years. You can look at the changing demographics of Northern Ireland, and you can look at changing mentality in England. I talked about English indifference to the Union, which I think is a real problem. And I think that it's also quite striking. If you look, for example, at old TV footage of England's World Cup run in 1966, the crowds are all waving Union flags. If you look at football or rugby, rugby's a bit different because it's the Six Nations, but if you look at soccer in the last decade, it's St George's crosses that are being waved, and the people painting their faces with the St George's cross, not the Union flag pattern. And I think there has been that large, until recently, unnoticed shift in English attitudes. So my own view on this is that it needs some changes in language and tactics from the government. It needs unionists across political parties to make a more positive case, not to rely only on explaining the risks and the downsides of quitting the United Kingdom, but to explain the positives of the United Kingdom. For unionists to find and celebrate the language about multiple identity that I referred to earlier, and it sounds this horrible sort of bit of almost sort of sociological jargon when you put it that way, but it's about saying that there's something like the Edinburgh festivals or the Nationalised Dead Fort can and should be celebrated by everybody in the United Kingdom. They can be both Scottish and UK or Welsh and UK. But I think also it does require a rethink about how the UK is governed. I don't get all the way with Gordon Brown, but I think there's merit in quite a lot of what he says. I think that we need to find a better way in which to manage relationships between the four governments. I think, for example, I was pleased when early in the pandemic it was clear that the first ministers and then their sort of appointed representatives were being involved in cabinet committees, and I think it's a source of regret that doesn't seem to have been continued. Although the medical officers and the science advisors from the four nations are all talking together and planning on a regular basis, and that's good, and that's the way things should happen. I think that part of getting this right involves finding a way in which to structure a forum for joint ministerial meetings where it's very clear who is there to represent England well. So you've got to have a minister at the table. It's their job to speak for English interests, and the chair of the meeting, which usually the United Kingdom minister, has to treat the chair's role as neutral as can be, and just try to get an agreed outcome. I think a lot can still be done through informal relationships. I mean, I wasn't perfect and I didn't get everything right, but I did try, for example, when I saw Mike Russell and his Welsh counterpart for joint ministerial meetings, I started a practice of seeing them completely privately with no officials, not even a private secretary, for half an hour beforehand, so they could talk to me in complete candor if they wanted. About things that were troubling. They could say, look, this cabinet colleague of yours is blocking something which is absolutely stupid, doesn't seem to understand the Devolution Act. And I could say, okay, understood, I will go away and try and sort that one out. And we could have that private, so try and work on the basis. Obviously fundamental disagreement between my position and the Conservative position, the Scottish National Party, about the eventual strategic outcome, but finding a way to work together despite our differences. We need to do more of that. And also within England, I have become a convert to the idea of devolution to mayoral and to unitary county and unitary borough level. And I would actually say, of course, the big undelivered item in the Smith Commission's recommendations was for devolution within Scotland. I think if you go to Aberdeen or to Dundee, sometimes Holyrood or the central belt dominance seems very distant. If you go to Shetland, even more so. In Wales, North Wales is a long way to drive from Cardiff Bay. And so again, why not devolve more there? And it's very interesting, when I was involved with the city deals, but in the devolved nations. What was striking was how, I saw people in Edinburgh, they'd say, look, the one thing we want to make clear to you, Minister, is that our deal needs to be different from Glasgow's, because we're a different economy and we have a sort of different civic tradition here. I got exactly the same in Northern Ireland when I went to Derry. And they're saying, look, you've got to think of us as different from Belfast. We're not an add-on from Belfast. And this is an economic zone that crosses the border as well. So you need to think about the northwest of the island of Ireland as well as Derry as the urban centre of that. And actually, I think it's going with the grain to push for more devolution within each of the devolved nations.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, we could of course have quite a long debate about the implementation of the levelling up agenda and the Internal Markets Act, but I think that probably takes us out of our remit. Dee, have you got any more questions you want to feed in from social media?
There's been various more comments about the Northern Ireland thing, particularly comments about people who should know better, who perhaps don't seem to know the content of the Good Friday Agreement. But I'm just going to read one comment because I think this is quite relevant in a way to what you've been saying. England needs its own parliament. And then the UK Parliament, just for certain things, would be much better. And there was another comment about education, and we have when you talk to Mike Russell and other people, have you been told that we have this course called Modern Studies up here in secondary schools? Do you know about that?
No, I'm not an expert on the details of the Scottish curriculum, I'm afraid.
Well, no, it's very interesting. I mean, I'm an ex-teacher from down south, and when I came up here and I saw a modern studies paper, I nearly kind of like went, oh my goodness, because it teaches about politics. Basically, it teaches the nuts and bolts of how politics works, but then also teaches the kids and gets them to discuss issues and talk about, write about issues and stuff. So it's not surprising that the Scottish electorate is perhaps a little bit more canny in a lot of ways, those that have done modern studies. So that's one more question in this conversation. You've mentioned that you're now convert to devolution. What influenced your conversion?
Yeah.
I'll leave it with you for that.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. Let's just do it very quickly, just very briefly on Northern Ireland, because I remain very interested in Northern Ireland and the UK-Ireland relationship, I'm deeply worried by what's happening on the streets at the moment. And I think there's got to be compromise on both sides. We all know that there are complex problems behind this disorder. It's not only about the protocol, or the protocol has had a big influence on this, but there's been a police drive against organised crime. There is the sense of alienation amongst the loyalist communities that is a parallel with what we're seeing in so many cities, in particular communities in the UK and elsewhere in Europe and in the United States as well. Just people who feel that the political elites, for lack of a better term, has been ignoring them and not delivering for them for years and years and years. So you've got all that going on, plus the policing issue over the Sinn Féin going to the IRA funeral last year. But I think there need to be two things. I think the British government needs to actually bite the bullet. They negotiated and signed the protocol. They should simply say, right, accept publicly this. We have to implement the protocol that we negotiated, and that will mean a certain number of differences between GB and NI and certain checks of various kinds. I would personally go further. I think the government might be reluctant to do this and say, if you would do what New Zealand has done and negotiate a veterinary treaty with the EU, actually you can limit the intrusiveness of quite a lot of the checks on livestock and on foodstuffs that are causing a lot of the friction at the moment. I have common SPS, sanitary and phytosanitary standards. but I think the EU needs to move as well, because I think the EU is in a sense a guarantor of the Belfast Agreement. Their argument for putting Northern Ireland into the sort of post-referendum talks rather than the talks about a new relationship was that peace in Northern Ireland is essential to the EU's interests, and that the risk of smuggling across the board, those borders, is so tiny. The volume of trade is so tiny as proportion to the EU's overall external trade that actually we should take this separately from the other external borders, Calais or Heathrow or wherever. And those arguments, those principles should apply equally now. And if it's still in the EU's essential interest to have peace and stability in Northern Ireland, I believe it is, then that argues for them de-dramatising the checks. And under Theresa May, we made a lot of progress with Michel Barnier in working out how, if the backstop of memory had ever been used, those checks would have been so at the workplace where something was manufactured, on the market, that you wouldn't have had to have systematic checks at the ports every time. Now, we did also say, the May government, we will stick to EU rules on agricultural produce and livestock, which would have made things a bit easier, and industrial goods for that matter. So that would have made things easier. But I think that sort of compromise is what's needed. On very briefly on the English Parliament, I just don't think classical federalism on a United States or an Australian or German model works, because England is so big in proportion to the other parts of the UK. I was converted to it partly, in that I'm a pragmatist, and after the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Assembly, as it first was set up by the Blair government. Once they've been established, people have been elected to them, and they've both been endorsed in referendums. If you're a Democrat, you accept that. You then decide to work with it, and they generated, political culture and consequences of their own. I just think I see no huge appetite in Scotland or in Northern Ireland or Wales to get rid of those national sort of devolved institutions and the Parliament. So I just don't think one wants to go there. What has converted me in terms of devolution with England, and for that matter within the other nations, is seeing how things worked out in practice when it came to trying to deliver complicated cross-Whitehall department initiatives. So levelling up would be one example at the moment. Zero carbon would be another. An industrial strategy or a skills strategy, whatever you want to call it, would be another issue. And what I saw, and I went round the country in various ministerial roles, I heard direct from people, was actually, if you've got a metro mayor who has convening power to bring together universities, business leaders, the various agencies of national government insofar as they apply to that metropolitan area, the local government agencies and powers, the police, fire service, housing, and so on, you actually start to tailor a plan for urban regeneration, for new infrastructure planned strategically, for drive to improve apprenticeships and skills in that part of the country, focusing on those industries that are most likely to provide jobs in that part of the country, and in partnership with the universities and the FE colleges. So, and it seemed to me that was a model that was starting to show results. And I remember going to see Andy Burnham a couple of years ago in his office in Manchester, and he said, I feel more fulfilled doing this job than I have doing anything else I've ever done in politics. And you could start to see how things are coming together. And outside the net areas, this has been the difficult thing. And I went to Cornwall as a minister, and they were one of the first to go for a unitary sort of county-wide authority. And what they got was a sort of Team Cornwall approach in the same way. Smaller population than Greater Manchester, but the council, the LEP, the Chamber of Commerce leaders, the educational leaders there, and they were working on a plan for improving educational and economic opportunities in Cornwall. And so I that is what has persuaded this work. And also getting to countries like Germany, see what is done at land level there. It just seems to me that this is important. And it also does start to tie political decisions more closely to the ambitions and expectations of people at a more grassroots level, in the way that I think Whitehall struggles to. Whitehall struggles really badly to implement cross-departmental priorities. They require everybody to compromise a bit, everybody to put a bit of money into the pot. And you can't micromanage Sheffield or Hull or Portsmouth from an office in Whitehall. So I think that's the way we need to go. We're a much more centralised country than most other advanced democracies.
Yeah, no,
and that applies in Scotland as well as in England.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely fascinating. That's a whole debate in itself. The regional development and leveling up. We did want to ask you as well, though, about some of the wider political issues of the Conservative Party in Europe, and you're chair of this new or reincarnated, really, I think, group called the Conservative European Forum, and I mean, obviously, many well-known pro-Europe Tories left politics towards the end of 2019, or left the Conservative Party at that time. So, I mean, how much support is there now for this kind of initiative in the Tory Party? And can you maybe say a bit more about what the ambitions are of this group, about what you want to do, what you want to achieve?
More support than some might think. I mean, we've got several hundred members and supporters of the Conservative European Forum, and these are people who are declared. I mean, according to opinion polls, roughly a fifth of Conservative voters in December 2019 were people who had voted Remain in the referendum. So, without that group of Conservative voting Remain supporters, there would not be a Conservative government at the moment. I also think that in the Conservative Party's long-term interest, electoral long-term interest, given the overwhelmingly pro-European stance of young people in this country, that it should not allow itself to be branded as a party that is hostile to a close and constructive partnership with other European democracies and with the European Union institutions. I think the government gets the first bit of that about the other European democracies. I think it's still neuralgic about the European Union institutionally, but I think that's a bridge we've yet to persuade them to cross. In terms of objectives, there are broadly three. One is to provide a forum for discussion amongst Conservatives about what kind of relationship we should have on various issues with the EU. So we had, for example, a very interesting webinar last autumn on green finance with John Gummer, former cabinet minister, now chairman of the government's commission on carbon, and a man called Roger Gifford, who is a former Lord Mayor of London, is one of the leading advocates of green finance within the city at the moment. So we've tried to explore those issues. Secondly, we act as advocates within the Conservative Party or the Conservative and the Conservative family, for the benefits of a close, friendly relationship with the EU democracies and with European democracies and with the EU institutionally. We're not advocating rejoining, as probably some of our members would like to rejoin. My own view is that that's, I think, off the agenda for the foreseeable future. If it ever happens, it won't be in my time. The next generation will take whatever decision the next generation takes. At the moment, I don't think the 27 would actually want to go through all the agonies of an accession process again, and they would, particularly in the absence of a political consensus in the UK about wanting to rejoin. If a government wanted to come back in, but the main opposition party was saying, no, we will revoke that at the first opportunity, that's not a stable basis to move things forward. And third, we are trying to maintain and improve relationships with the mainstream centre-right parties, primarily the EPP parties around Europe. We've had a number of speakers already. We've had David McAllister, MEP from the CDU, chairs the Foreign Affairs Committee in the European Parliament. We've had Alexander Stubb, former Prime Minister of Finland, speaking to us. We have had Norbert Röttgen, the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the Bundestag, speak to us, and we hope to get other speakers. And of course, one of the things we've all learned in the last year in numerous organisations is how you have to manage things when you're forced to go online rather than meet in person. Actually, one of the things we don't want to lose is this ability to have meetings that bring in speakers who are in a different country or in a different part of your own country, not just rely on who might happen to be in London in a particular evening or lunchtime.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, I mean, there seem to be quite few Conservatives who are willing to sort of like stick their heads above the parapet, so to speak, and there's also the charge that maybe those pro EU Tories that there are should be sticking their heads, maybe a bit higher, and for instance, campaigning to rejoin Erasmus or Erasmus Plus. Do you, how do you respond to that? Could you see your forum campaigning for closer alignment on some of these issues?
I think yes. I think what we will. Yes, I can. I think we will pick campaigns very carefully, because what I don't want to do is have a whole multiplicity of campaigns on which we're challenging the leadership all at the same time, because that's actually not going to regain an influential voice for us within the Conservative Party. And I think that in terms of looking to the future strategically, if you believe that it's in the UK's interest for there to be a good constructive partnership between the UK and the other European countries and the EU, then you want those voices to have influence within all the mainstream political parties, and for it not to be a simple, battle between different political parties on that question. It will take time. We are at the moment, we've had an earthquake as a result of Brexit in UK politics, and we're still in the aftershock period, if I can put it that way. And I think COVID's also meant that the bandwidth available for thinking about anything other than the pandemic has been reduced to the minimum in pretty much every country in the world at the moment. And of course, people have not met in person much, so the ability to have those quiet conversations in a corner, get to know people, re-establish habits of trust, hasn't been there. You can't do that on Zoom. Yeah. So this is going to take time. What I point to is how the Johnson government has actually behaved since it came to office. And there have been, rows with the EU, and I've sometimes disagreed publicly or privately with those. Sometimes I've actually felt they had some right on their side. But look at what they've done, for example, on Iran, on Israel-Palestine, on carbon. On all of those issues, the Johnson government has stuck pretty closely aligned with the EU position, despite everything that Donald Trump was saying during his term, to try to detach the UK from those positions. If you look at how Boris Johnson has responded to the ongoing battle against terrorism and organised crime in the Sahel, he sent more British troops out there at the request of President Macron to support a French-led peacekeeping initiative there. So actually, when you go below some of the surface headlines, there's evidence that things can be taken in a more encouraging direction. If you read the recently published integrated review of UK security policy, there was perhaps less on Europe than I personally would have wanted to see there, but there were quite a lot of olive twigs scattered throughout that document. And so I think where campaigns should focus is on things that will add to the TCA in a way that starts to put together a more broadly based strategic partnership with European democracies with whom we share so many interests in common, and with whom the Biden administration will be pressing us to work closely, just as they'll be pressing Brussels to work closely with the UK.
Yep, that sounds like a good note to end on a positive note, even if many of us don't often feel so positive these days. Listen, you've been tremendously generous with your time and expertise. It's been great to chat with you, and we look forward to seeing what happens with the Conservative European Forum, and maybe campaigning with you alongside you on some issues. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.